Your last collection stole from 12 women who will never see a sync credit. I've documented all 12.
I know, you know.
I know.
That's why I wrote to you another name at work.
And the ones who are meeting.
Most men in your position would be defending themselves right now.
Most men in my position haven't read your work. They'd know better than to argue with you.
What exactly are you asking me for?
A chance to build something worth your name on it.
You have one meeting.
I know, I'll make it count.
Welcome to K-AFRIQUE TV. Like, comment, and subscribe to support this channel. The runway lights were still burning when the world ended. Adaeze Obi was sitting in the third row of Seoul's most prestigious fashion venue, her press pass warm in her fingers, when the murmur started moving through the audience like fire through dry cloth. Person to person, phone to phone, the particular ripple of a crowd discovering that something irreversible has just occurred. Around her, editors reached for their screens. Publicists stepped away from their seats with phones pressed to their ears and expressions carefully arranged into professional neutrality. A woman 2 seats to Adaeze left whispered something in rapid Korean and then looked up at the stage with the bright, barely concealed hunger of someone watching a very expensive thing break. Adaeze did not reach for her phone. She already knew what was on it. She had published the post 48 hours ago. 12 pages. 4 years of research. 47 documented instances of pattern reproduction across 9 West African textile traditions, traced through the House of Seo's last 6 collections with the methodical precision of someone who had been building this case, the way engineers build bridges, not for drama, but for the weight it would need to hold. She had not expected it to travel this fast. She had not expected to be sitting here when it landed. The first model walked out and Adaeze's breath contracted. The gown was indigo, deep, almost violent indigo, structured in the resist-dye geometry of Yoruba Adir, the pattern as specific and identifiable to her trained eye as a fingerprint. She knew this cloth. She had sat in the workshop of the woman who designed this pattern, a 73-year-old master artisan in Abeokuta named Mama Folisade, who had pressed a small square of the original fabric into Adaeze's hand at the end of their interview, and said, softly, "Keep this. Someday someone will need to see the original." Asterisk, that fabric was now moving down a Seoul runway under someone else's name, priced at 4 million won, credited to no one but Seo. Adaeze sat completely still and felt something she had not anticipated, not triumph, not vindication, not the clean satisfaction of a case proven. What she felt was grief. The specific, exhausting grief of a woman who had spent her entire career documenting the same wound and had never quite grown immune to the sight of it reopening. She had not come to celebrate. She had come because she needed to see it for herself, needed the confirmation that what she had written was not abstract, that the women whose names appeared in her footnotes were real, and their loss was real, and the world that kept taking from them without looking back was real. She had come for the record. She was not prepared for what happened at the 23rd minute. A PR assistant moved onto the stage with the specific speed of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. The host's face changed. The music stopped mid-crescendo, and in the silence that followed, the held breath, crystalline silence of 500 people, simultaneously understanding that something has gone wrong, Adaeze looked toward the back of the venue. Seo Jin-Ho was standing at the entrance to the backstage corridor. She had seen photographs. She had studied his public record for 4 years. She had built a thorough and detailed professional understanding of who he was. None of it had prepared her for the actuality of him, the height, the stillness, the way he occupied space without performing it. He was not scanning the room for exits or reaching for his phone or arranging his expression for the cameras that were now swiveling toward him. He was standing completely still, and he was looking at the stage, and on his face was the expression of a man who has just understood something he cannot unknow, not arrogance, not the face she had constructed across 4 years of research. Something rower than that. Something that looked, from 30 meters away, like the specific devastation of a man confronting the full weight of what he actually is. Adaeze looked away first. She gathered her bag and left before the press descended, and she did not look back, and she told herself she was finished with Seo Jin-Ho. Her work was done. The record existed. What happened next was the world's business, not hers. She told herself this with great conviction all the way to the subway, and almost believed it. Adaeze had come to Seoul intending to stay 18 months. That had been the plan, clean, bounded, professionally productive. Complete the fellowship at Yonsei, finish the manuscript, return to Lagos with enough material to sustain 3 more years of research. A plan with clear edges. She preferred things with clear edges. Lagos was home in the way that only cities that have rebuilt you from the inside can be home. She had grown up in Seoul in a flat above her mother's fabric stall, and the sounds of her childhood were the sounds of commerce and craft mixed together. The stall opening at 5 in the morning, the loom running in the back room until midnight, her mother Ngozi moving between the two with the unhurried fluency of a woman who had never considered that what she did might be extraordinary, because she had always simply done it. Ngozi's hands were the first education Adaeze ever received. Before school, before books, before the scholarship that took her to Ibadan, and then to London, and then to the fellowship that brought her to Seoul, before all of it, there were her mother's hands. The way they read fabric by touch, weight and weave and tension, telling a story that eyes alone could not access. The way they moved through the geometry of a pattern, as though the cloth were a language being spoken rather than a material being manipulated. Adaeze had inherited those hands. She had also inherited her mother's memory. She was 16 when the European runway collection appeared. A French luxury house, spring show, Paris. Her mother's signature chevron, a pattern Ngozi had developed over 20 years, refined across hundreds of iterations, specific to her workshop and her lineage, reproduced without acknowledgement across an entire ready-to-wear line. The collection won a design award. A magazine ran 4 pages on the creative director's visionary originality. Adaeze had found the spread and brought it home, hands shaking. Her mother had looked at it for a long time. She had not cried, had not shouted, had not done any of the things a 16-year-old expects from a parent confronting theft. She had folded the magazine carefully along its spine and placed it on the shelf above the loom, spine outward, and said quietly, "Keep this. Someday you will know what to do with it." Adaeze had known what to do with it by the time she was 24. She had spent the decade since doing it, publishing, documenting, testifying at intellectual property forums, training researchers younger than herself to trace the patterns the industry kept laundering through the machinery of high fashion. She was not angry in the way that consumed. She was angry in the way that constructed, steady and exacting and entirely without sentimentality. Seoul had surprised her. She had expected distance, professional, cultural, climatic. Instead, the city had moved into her bones in a way she hadn't budgeted for. The Han River at 5 in the morning. The specific amber quality of autumn light over Bakshan's tiled rooftops. The Pajangmacha 3 streets from the university where the owner, a woman of approximately 70 who had never asked Adeeze's name, but always saved her the last bowl of Sunjubu jjiggy, communicated warmth through economy of gesture in a way that reminded Adaeze, achingly, of home. She had built a careful life here. Bounded, productive, safe. The letter arrived on a Tuesday and dismantled every one of those adjectives in 2 pages. It was handwritten. That was the first thing that stopped her. Not an email, not a legal communication, not the expected contact from a PR team managing the fallout. A letter, handwritten in formal Korean, her name spelled correctly in both Hangul and Roman script, delivered to her university office in an envelope with no return address. Her assistant had placed it on top of her marking pile with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided not to have an opinion about something. Adaeze had carried it home unopened. She had made tea, graded 4 student papers, looked at the envelope 7 times, and opened it on the 8th. It was 2 pages. The Korean was architectural in its formality, structured and precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to using language with intention. She read it with a dictionary, then without. Then again, Seo Jin-Ho was not apologizing. That was what unsteadied her. There was no performance of remorse. No careful calibration of contrition designed to be screenshotted and shared. What he had written was more unsettling than an apology. It was an account of understanding. He wrote that he had read her post 17 times. He wrote that on the 14th reading, he had finally grasped that what she described was not an industry problem, or a legal gray area, or an attribution failure, but something older and more damaging than any of those clean professional categories. A pattern of erasure so normalized that the people participating in it had stopped being able to see it, including him. He wrote that he did not expect her to forgive this. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for one meeting, at a tea house in Insadong, the following Saturday at 10 in the morning, because he wanted to understand what he had taken well enough to spend whatever came next trying to make it matter differently. He wrote that if she chose not to appear, he would receive that as the consequence most proportionate to his choices. He signed it with his full name and no title. Adaeze sat with it for 11 days. She told herself she wasn't going. She told this to her laptop screen at 2 in the morning while cross-referencing his design archive against her research database. 11 years of collections, every sourcing credit, every mood board she could access. She told it to herself on Friday night while ironing a blouse she had not consciously selected. She woke up Saturday morning already dressed and took the subway to Insadong without having made a decision she was aware of making. He was there when she arrived. The tea house was the kind of place Seoul kept hidden in its older neighborhoods. Low ceilings, ceramic walls the color of winter sky, the smell of chrysanthemum and aged wood settling over everything like a held breath. He was at a corner table, both hands wrapped around a cup, not performing patience, but actually patient, looking at the grain of the wood table with the focused attention of a man who had stopped needing to be seen. He was thinner than his photographs. The expensive precision of his public image had been replaced by a dark jacket worn without thought, the kind of garment reached for in the morning when appearance has temporarily stopped mattering. He looked like someone who had stripped away every layer of performance and was sitting in what remained, which was apparently more substantial than she had expected. He looked up as she sat down. Something shifted in his expression, not relief, not calculation, recognition. As though she were exactly what he had anticipated and the anticipation had not diminished the reality. "You came," he said. "You have 40 minutes, she said. "Start!" Corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the trace of a man who had once known how to use humor and was relearning whether it was still permitted. He did not reach for charm. He simply nodded and started talking. He talked for 38 minutes. He told her about Park Sung-won, his creative director of a decade, the man he had trusted entirely with sourcing and development. He described the process in specific detail, the mood boards, the research trips, the directional notes, and how Sung-won had presented the designs as original work developed from West African research visits, and how Jin-Ho had approved them with the uncritical confidence of a man who had never had sufficient reason to doubt the person he trusted most. When the scandal broke, Sung-won had called him with 20 minutes' notice before going live on television. He had presented a choice: resign publicly and frame it as a protest against Jin-Ho's leadership, or be exposed fully, which would destroy not just his career but a family with 2 young children and a wife 3 months into cancer treatment. Jin-Ho had made the decision in 4 minutes. He had said nothing. Not then. Not since. He had stood in the wreckage of his own name and absorbed a verdict written in someone else's handwriting. And the only person he had told before today was the Pajang Matcha owner 3 streets from his former office, who had responded by putting food in front of him and talking about her grandchildren. Adaeze listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, the tea house held the particular quality of silence that follows something true, denser than ordinary quiet, weighted differently. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice was even, giving nothing away, the same register she used in expert testimony when she needed to think 3 steps ahead of her words. "Because you deserve the truth." He met her eyes without deflection. "Not because it changes my culpability. I approved those designs. I profited from them. I should have asked harder questions. But you have spent your career demanding that this industry tell the truth about what it takes and from whom. I thought you deserved the same from me. What do you want from me in return? Nothing." A pause. "Everything eventually, but not yet." Something in his voice shifted, quieter, more careful, as though he were placing a fragile object down. "For now, I want to know how to make it right, not the press release version of right, the actual version." Adaeze looked at him across the ceramic cups and the chrysanthemum-scented air, and felt something she had not allocated space for: the specific, inconvenient recognition of a person who is more than the file you built on them. She stood up. "Think about it," she said, and left before he could respond, and walked out into the cool Insadong morning and kept walking for 45 minutes without direction because she needed the motion, needed the Seoul air and the sound of the city around her, and the physical reality of pavement beneath her feet, while the ground rearranged itself into a new configuration she had not anticipated and was not yet ready to name. She thought about it for 11 days. On the 12th day, she called him, and he picked up on the second ring, and the sound of his voice answering, unhurried, certain, as though he had simply been waiting without anxiety for something he trusted would come, landed in her chest with a precision she felt for the rest of the evening. She told herself it was professional interest. She told herself this with great conviction. She was already lying. She called him on a Wednesday evening when the rain was coming down sideways against her apartment windows, and she had run out of arguments against herself. He picked up on the second ring. She had prepared for voicemail, had half constructed what she would say to it, clean, bounded, professional, the kind of message that could be replayed without revealing anything. His voice answering directly, low and unhurried as still water, dismantled the entire preparation in an instant. "Been waiting," he said, not "I wondered if you'd call." Not asterisk "thank you for reaching out," just that. Certain and quiet and entirely without pressure, the way a man waits when he is not afraid of the outcome because he has already decided what he is willing to do regardless of it. Adaeze gripped her phone slightly tighter. "Don't read into this." A pause, brief, warm, containing something she refused to identify. "I wouldn't dare." They met the following morning at his office. The Seo label's headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of a Gangnam building that now had the particular atmosphere of a theater between productions. The infrastructure of something grand still present, the life that had filled it conspicuously absent. The reception desk sat empty. The seasonal display cases that had once held archival pieces from his most celebrated collections stood bare, their glass reflecting the morning light back at nothing. 2 junior staff moved through the far end of the space with the careful quietness of people who had decided to stay somewhere that most people had decided to leave. Jin-Ho met her at the elevator himself. She had not expected that. Men at his level, at his former level, sent assistance. Made you wait in reception while they finished something more important, establishing the grammar of power before a meeting had properly begun. Instead, he was standing in the elevator lobby in a charcoal shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the first thing Adaeze registered, before she could redirect her attention to something more professionally appropriate, was the quality of his stillness. He was not fidgeting, not checking his phone, not performing the casual confidence of a man pretending he hadn't been watching the elevator numbers count upward. He was simply standing there, looking at her with those dark, level eyes, and the directness of it, the complete absence of social management, hit her somewhere she had not budgeted for. She walked past him into the office. "You still have staff," she said, nodding toward the 2 figures at the far end. Yuna and Di-hyun. Something moved through his expression, not quite pride, not quite grief, but the specific tenderness of a man surprised by loyalty he knows he did not earn. "I told them to leave. 4 times. They keep returning." He paused. "I've stopped arguing with people who have already decided." There was something in the way he said it, the slight shift in register on the last sentence, as though it meant more than its surface, that made Adaeze walk slightly faster toward the design studio at the back. The studio was the only room in the building that still felt inhabited by purpose. Fabric samples covered one wall in overlapping layers. Textures and weights and colors accumulated over years, the material residue of a creative life. The long worktable held bolts of undyed linen, open reference books, pencil sketches weighted down at their corners with whatever was nearest. The room smelled of raw cloth and graphite, and faintly, of the black coffee sitting cold and forgotten on the corner of the table, the specific smell of someone who had been here early and had not stopped to eat or drink since. Adaeze moved toward the fabric wall before she had consciously decided to. Her hands reached out the way her mother had trained them, feeling before looking, reading the weight and weave and conversation of the cloth before the eyes imposed their own interpretation. She moved from sample to sample with the focused absorption of someone who had temporarily forgotten she was being observed. She became aware of his stillness behind her. She turned. He was standing exactly where she had left him, 3 meters back, and he was watching her hands with an expression she could not immediately classify, open and intent, and stripped of the careful management she had seen him apply to every other moment since they'd met. He looked, for just that instant, like a man seeing something he had not known he was looking for. "You read cloth like that too," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "My mother taught me." She lowered her hands. "Before I could read words, I could read fabric, weight, weave, tension." She said cloth doesn't lie if you know how to ask it the right question. Something shifted in his face, the particular expression of a person who has just heard something that resonates against their own history. My grandmother made asterisk pajagi, he said. Patchwork wrapping cloth. She said every piece of fabric is already having a conversation. The designer's job is not to speak over it, but to listen. He paused. She would have found the last 6 years of this company very difficult to explain. Adaeze looked at him steadily. And yet you spent a decade not listening. She delivered it without cruelty, but without softening either. The precise, even application of a truth that needed to be spoken plainly between them before anything else could be built on top of it. She watched him receive it. No deflection, no flash of defensive anger, no performance of wounded humility designed to make her feel she had gone too far. He simply absorbed it with the steadiness of a man who had decided that the truth was something he owed rather than something being done to him. Yes, he said. I did. She pulled out her laptop. The proposal she placed before him was not gentle and had not been designed to be. She had spent 11 days constructing it with the same exacting rigor she brought to peer-reviewed research, and it showed in every clause. Not a Korean fashion house with African aesthetic influence. Not a collaboration structured to generate progressive press coverage during awards season. A genuine founding partnership, African textile artists credited as co-designers in the legal documentation, not consultants listed in the fine print. Profit sharing embedded in the company's constitutional structure. An attribution charter with legal teeth. An advisory board with majority representation drawn from the source communities, holding real governance weight. She had named it Oja, the Yoruba word for market. The place where value is created, exchanged, and returned. She walked him through it without softening a single clause and watched his face the way she watched every room she had ever testified in, tracking the micro-expressions, the places where resistance would surface if resistance was present, the moments where ego would push against anything that required its own diminishment. She found none of it. He read every page as she presented it. When she reached the profit-sharing structure, 30% allocated to the partner collectives, she paused, waiting. Investors will walk away at 30%, he said. I know. He looked up from page 7. Good. Then we find investors who understand what they're investing in. He closed the document with the quiet finality of someone who has finished considering something and arrived at a position. Send me the full version tonight. I want to go through the governance structure in detail. Adaeze studied him. She had prepared for negotiation. Had prepared for the polite dismantling of her most ambitious clauses under the cover of financial pragmatism. She had not prepared for good. Asterisk, you're agreeing to all of it, she said. Yes, without conditions. Without conditions that change the substance. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and the shift in proximity, small, physical, entirely businesslike and somehow not businesslike at all, brought a new quality of attention into the room. I asked you here because I wanted to do this with integrity. Not almost with integrity. Not with integrity where it was convenient. His voice was level, but the current beneath it was not. If I wanted cosmetic repair, I would have hired a publicist. I came to you because you are the person in this industry who cannot be bought or managed or charmed into accepting less than the truth. That is what I need beside me. You haven't established that I'll be beside you yet. We haven't discussed my terms. She had them prepared. Co-creative director title with full decision-making authority. Academic credit for the attribution framework embedded in the brand's founding documents. An unconditional exit clause if the brand ever compromised its founding principles. Her name removed cleanly. Her intellectual property returned fully, no legal entanglement. She laid them out in sequence, watching his face. He agreed to everyone. It should have felt like winning. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something she did not have adequate vocabulary for, something that moved beneath the professional surface of the conversation like a current she had not charted and was therefore not equipped to navigate. She closed her laptop. Send the full document tonight, she said. I'll have responses by morning. She nodded, stood, reached for her bag. She was almost at the studio door when his voice came from behind her, not calling her back, not requesting anything, simply saying her name in that particular register that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the 11 days between the tea house and the phone call. Adaeze. She stopped but did not turn. Yes. Thank you for coming back. She stood in the doorway for one breath, two, feeling the weight of those 4 words settle somewhere she was not ready to examine. "Thank me yet," she said, and left. In the elevator going down, she pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed out slowly. She was in significantly more trouble than she had budgeted, for the first 3 months were a war on every front, except the one that mattered most. His remaining investors called it professional suicide. Her academic peers called it a compromise of research integrity. The Korean fashion press ran pieces with headlines that made her jaw tighten over her morning coffee: Seo Jin-Ho's African redemption tour, the scholar who became a brand asset, diversity as damage control. As though her expertise were a narrative device in someone else's recovery story. As though she were furniture that had been repositioned to improve the room's appearance. She published a response piece under her own name that ran in 3 publications simultaneously. She did not use the words *angry or *offended or *hurt. She didn't need to. She simply laid out, with the precise, unhurried clarity of someone who has been waiting years for the right occasion, exactly what the difference was between exploitation with attribution and exploitation without it. Exactly what Oja was structurally designed to do, and why that structure was unprecedented. And exactly what the ongoing pattern of reducing Black women's professional contributions to their proximity to powerful men said about the people doing the reducing rather than the women being reduced. She sent it to Jin-Ho at 6 in the morning before it published, because she believed he deserved to see it first. He called her before she had finished her first coffee. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something rougher at the edges, as though he had read the piece and it had moved through him in a way he hadn't fully processed yet. "I know, I wanted to." She paused. "Also, you're welcome." Silence on his end lasted long enough that she moved the phone from her ear to check the connection. Then, low and unguarded, escaping as though it had not been sanctioned, he laughed. A real laugh, unmanaged and genuine, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he still had access to that particular sound. It moved through the phone and arrived somewhere in her chest with a warmth she noted, catalogued, and absolutely did not act on. "Line about narrative devices," he said once he had recovered. "Was that aimed at anyone specific? It was aimed at everyone generally. We'll land on everyone specifically." "Good," she said. "That was the intention." Another brief silence, this one different in texture, softer. "Adaeze!" I read it 4 times. She looked out her apartment window at the Seoul morning assembling itself in gray and amber outside. Something pulled at the center of her chest like a thread being drawn taut. "Go to work, Jin-Ho," she said quietly. "Going," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, the shape of it, and that was somehow worse and better than the laugh the studio became its own world. They worked every day, sometimes 14 hours, sometimes more, the city outside the windows cycling through its seasons while inside, Oja accumulated substance piece by piece. Fabric samples from Lagos and Accra and Nairobi spread across the work tables beside Jin-Ho's architectural sketches. Reference photographs from the partner communities pinned alongside his structural drawings. The sound of the space shifted over weeks, from the hollow quiet of a building holding its breath to something alive, layered, purposeful. Jin-Ho worked the way Adaeze imagined tidal forces worked, completely, inevitably, without apparent effort and with enormous effect. When he was designing, he was entirely unreachable by anything that was not the work, his focus so absolute it had a physical quality, a density that changed the atmosphere of whatever room it occupied. She found this simultaneously extraordinary and deeply inconvenient, because a man that that genuinely, unperformatively present, was difficult to maintain appropriate distance from. She maintained it anyway. What she could not maintain was the fiction that she wasn't noticing him. She noticed everything, which was humiliating given that she was a person who prided herself on directing her attention with precision. She noticed the way he stood at the fabric wall each morning before beginning work, both hands pressed flat against the samples, reading the cloth the way she had shown him without being asked to show him. She noticed that he had quietly rearranged the studio so that her work table had the better light without mentioning it. She noticed that he remembered, without being told a second time, exactly how she took her coffee, black, 1 sugar, the sugar stirred in before the coffee was poured, which was particular and slightly irrational, and he had observed it once and never forgotten. She noticed that he never touched her. Not incidentally, not accidentally. The studio was small, and they worked in close proximity for hours at a stretch, and there was no natural reason for the care he took to maintain the physical distance between them, except the very specific reason she was not supposed to think about directly. He was waiting. He had told her he would wait, and he was doing it, with a patience that was not passive but active, not absence, but the deliberate, considered presence of someone who has made a decision and is living it out with their whole attention. It was the most devastating thing anyone had ever done in her vicinity. The evening it broke was a Tuesday in the second month. They had been working for 11 hours on the structural layout of the first collection, 16 looks, each one mapped against its design origin documentation, the attribution thread running through every piece like a spine. The city outside had gone fully dark. The studio existed in the warm pool of the worktable light. Everything beyond its edges receded into irrelevance. Jin-Ho reached across her to reposition a bolt of indigo fabric. His arm crossed hers. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, forearm against forearm, the warmth of it moving through her like the first note of a song she recognized and had not heard in years. Neither of them moved. The studio held its breath. The fabric sat where neither of them had put it, suspended in the space between where it had been and where he'd intended it to go. Adaeze stepped back. Jin-Ho completed the motion, placed the fabric where he had been reaching, returned to his side of the table, picked up his pencil. His face revealed nothing. His hand on the pencil was perfectly steady, but she had seen, in the 2 seconds before he recovered, the precise moment when his composure had not been a choice but an effort. The fractional tightening around his eyes. The single controlled breath. She turned back to her work and said nothing because there was nothing that could be said without opening a door she was not ready to walk through. But she knew, and he knew that she knew. And the studio held that knowledge between them like a third presence at the table, and they worked around it in silence for another 3 hours. And when she finally left that night, she stood on the pavement outside the building in the cold Seoul air and pressed her fingers against her own forearm, where his had been, and stood there for longer than she would ever admit 3 weeks later. Jin-Ho did something she had not seen coming. The industry publication Seoul Fashion Review ran a piece that weekend. She had expected coverage. Oja was generating enough industry interest to guarantee it. She had not expected the angle. The journalist had spoken to 4 anonymous industry sources, all of whom described Adaeze as Jin-Ho's strategic asset, a credibility purchase, an academic veneer applied to a rebranding exercise, the most expensive piece of cultural decoration in recent Seoul fashion history. The piece did not use her name in a byline. It used it the way people use names when they mean and here is the person who should feel embarrassed. Asterisk, she read it at 7 in the morning and sat with it, very still, feeling the familiar settling weight of a world deciding that her expertise was window dressing and her presence was decor. At 9, Jin-Ho walked into the studio and placed a printed copy on the table in front of her. She had not told him about it, and said, "I've spoken to the editor." She looked up. "What? I called him 40 minutes ago." His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "I told him that every technical, structural, and philosophical framework that Oja is built on originated with you. That my role in this partnership would not exist without the 10 years of research you produced before I had the privilege of encountering it. That if his publication runs another piece that treats your intellectual contribution as peripheral to your own work, I will ensure that the primary story about Seoul Fashion Review for the next 2 years is their editorial decision-making process." He paused. "He is reconsidering the framing." Adaeze stared at him. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I know. I am entirely capable of fighting my own battles. I know that too." He met her eyes without apology. "I didn't do it because I thought you couldn't. I did it because it needed to be said by me, specifically. Because I am the person whose name they're using to diminish yours. And that is not something I was willing to let stand for another hour." Something moved in his jaw, a tightening, a restraint applied to something that wanted to be less restrained. "You are not a decorative element in my story, Adaeze. You are the architect of the most important thing I have ever been involved in. That is the fact. I will keep saying it in every room until it becomes the only version anyone remembers." Studio was absolutely silent. Adaeze looked at him across the work table. This man who had let a scandal burn his career to the ground rather than drag a family into the fire. who had come to her not with lawyers, but with a handwritten letter, who remembered how she took her coffee and rearranged the lighting without mentioning it, and stood at the fabric wall each morning learning the language she had grown up speaking, and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. "You are making this very difficult," she said, her voice lower than she intended. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to. That's what makes it difficult." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the quality of the silence changed, deepened, became more specific, held the particular density of two people standing on the same threshold and both knowing it. Then his phone buzzed on the table. Then hers. Then the studio speaker chimed with an incoming call notification. The world, with its characteristic indifference to private moments, resumed. The Sungwon visit arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Jin-Ho was out. Adaeze was alone at the work table when the studio door opened, and a man she didn't recognize stood in the doorway, well-dressed, visibly uncomfortable, looking at the room with the expression of someone who has rehearsed arriving somewhere and found the reality more difficult than the rehearsal. "He's not here," she said, without looking up from the fabric layout. "I know," said the man. "I came to speak to you." Something in the way he said it made her look up. Park Sung-won sat down across from her without invitation, the action of a man too desperate for the performance of protocol, and clasped his hands on the table and began to speak. He talked for 40 minutes. Adaeze did not interrupt once. When he finished, she sat with what he had told her in the particular quality of silence that follows an earthquake. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a landscape that has just been entirely rearranged and has not yet settled into its new shape. She had published a 12-page post, 4 years of research, 47 documented instances presented as the work of one man's sustained, conscious cultural theft. Seo Jin-Ho had not known. He had approved the designs, yes. He had profited from them, yes. He bore culpability for a system of trust that had no sufficient accountability built into it. But the deliberate sourcing, the fabrication of research documentation, the constructed trail that had made him look like the architect of the theft, that had been Sungwon. Not him. And when the world had arrived to collect its verdict, Jin-Ho had stepped into it alone rather than pull a sick woman's husband into the fire. Adaeze stood up after Sungwon left and walked to the fabric wall and pressed both hands flat against it, the way Jin-Ho did each morning, and stood there and breathed. She had spent her career on the precision of attribution, on the moral and professional imperative of ensuring that the record correctly identified who had done what and why it mattered. She had published, under her name, a case that was structurally accurate and factually incomplete. She had not known it was incomplete. She could not have known. But the incompleteness existed regardless, and it had been absorbed into the public record under her authorship. And the woman who had built her entire professional identity on the integrity of the record now had to sit with the knowledge that the record, her record, was not the full truth. She heard Jin-Ho's key in the front door 20 minutes later. He came into the studio and stopped when he saw her face, both hands still pressed against the fabric wall, her back to him, her shoulders carrying something visible. "Who was here?" he said quietly. She turned. She looked at him across the studio. The bolts of indigo and rust and gold spread across the worktable between them, the architectural sketches and the attribution documents, and the careful material evidence of something being built right. And she felt the specific fury of a woman who has been given, too late, information that would have changed everything, and who cannot be angry at the person who withheld it because she understands, with devastating clarity, exactly why he did. "Sit down, Jin-Ho," he sat. He did not ask questions, did not reach for his phone, did not perform any of the deflecting behaviors of a person bracing for an accusation. He simply sat down and looked at her with the steadiness that she had initially read as arrogance and now understood was something else entirely. The particular stillness of a man who had already made his peace with the worst possible version of whatever was coming. "One was here," she said. Something in his face did not change and simultaneously changed completely. "He told me everything," she said. "The sourcing, the documentation, the call he made 20 minutes before he went on television." She paused. "The choice he gave you." Jin-Ho looked at the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was quiet in the way that had nothing to do with calm. "Because it doesn't change the essential facts. Changes the entire story. The designs were still taken from those women." He looked up. "I still signed them. I still put my name on them and sold them and accepted the recognition for them. The chain of responsibility leads back to me regardless of who held the first link. His voice was even, but there was something running beneath it, not defensiveness, but the particular intensity of a man who has had this argument with himself so many times, he has worn the path smooth. Telling you about someone would have looked like I was asking you to feel sorry for me. To reduce what you documented to a misunderstanding rather than a systemic failure I participated in knowingly or not. That is not your decision to make, Adaeze said. The accuracy of the record is not yours to manage on my behalf. I know. He met her eyes. You're right, and I'm sorry. She walked to the window. Seoul moved below, indifferent and brilliant, and she stood looking at it and felt the complicated, uncomfortable texture of being right and wrong simultaneously. Right that he should have told her. Wrong that she was standing here trying to be angry at a man who had chosen silence to protect strangers from consequences that were not theirs to carry. I published an incomplete account, she said. Under my name, my research, my professional signature. You published what the evidence showed. The evidence was managed, she turned. Someone managed what I was able to see, and I didn't see it, and my post is in the permanent record as it stands. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes were bright with something that was not tears yet, but was one wrong word away from becoming them. Do you understand what that costs me? Not the relationship, not the partnership, my professional identity. The thing I built my entire life on. Jin-Ho stood up. He came around the table slowly, the way he moved when he had decided something and was not revering it. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with an expression that was entirely without strategy, open and direct, and carrying the full weight of what he was about to say. I understand, he said, and I am not going to tell you it doesn't matter or that it can be fixed quietly or that the record won't reflect it. It will. That is the cost, and it is a cost I imposed on you by my silence, and I am sorry in a way that words are genuinely insufficient for. He paused. But I need to tell you something else. She looked at him. You are the most rigorous person I have ever encountered, he said. Your post was built on 4 years of documented evidence that no one in this industry had the courage or the precision to compile before you. The incompleteness that exists in it is a detail that you will correct publicly and on the record, because that is who you are, and when you do, it will demonstrate more professional integrity than this entire industry has shown in a decade. His voice dropped. The record will reflect that too. Adaeze looked at him for a long moment, this infuriating, impossible man standing in front of her with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his complete, unmanaged attention directed entirely at her, and felt the last organized layer of her defenses develop a crack it was not going to recover from. You are, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the most complicated person I have ever had the profound misfortune of respecting. Something moved across his face, not a smile, but the warm, aching predecessor of one. I know, he said softly. I'm sorry for that too, apologizing. Try. They stood in the studio in the amber evening light with the indigo fabric spread between them and Seoul carrying on outside with its magnificent indifference. And the air held everything that had not yet been said with a weight and a warmth and a particular kind of patience that felt, if she was honest. And she was always honest. Even when it cost her, less like waiting and more like arriving. She stepped back first. She always stepped back first. But this time, stepping back, she said something she had not planned and could not retrieve. Yet, she said, quietly, almost to herself, the 2 words dropped into the silence between them and sent out their ripples. Jin-Ho went very still. "K," he said. His voice was low and careful and entirely sincere. "I heard you." She looked at him. Searching for the catch, the negotiation, the thing he wanted in exchange for the patience. There was nothing. Just him, steady and certain and present. You said not yet, he said simply. I can wait. Adaeze turned back to the window. Outside, Seoul blazed and moved and carried on. Somewhere in the city, a Pajangmacha owner was saving the last bowl of Sunjubu jjigi for someone who needed it. Somewhere a 73-year-old woman in Abeokuta was sitting at a loom that held generations of knowledge in its rhythm. Somewhere the record of what had been taken and what was being rebuilt existed in documents with both their names on them, incomplete and true and still being written. Inside, a man stood 3 feet behind her, and waited without impatience for something he had decided was worth waiting for. And Adaeze Obi, who had built her entire life on knowing precisely what things were worth, stood at the window with the city burning below her and felt the architecture of her careful, bounded, professionally productive life reorganize itself around a fact she could no longer document her way out of. She was in love with him. The knowledge arrived not as a revelation, but as a recognition, the feeling not of discovering something new, but of finally looking directly at something that had been present for weeks, patient as the man standing behind her, waiting to be acknowledged. She did not turn around, not yet, but her reflection in the dark window, honest in the way reflections always are, was already wearing something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of a smile. The Paris offer arrived on a Monday in a formal envelope delivered simultaneously to both their desks, and the number at the center of it, 50 million euros, had the specific quality of a thing that rearranges the air in a room simply by being present in it. Adaeze stared at it until the digits stopped looking like digits and started looking like her mother's hands. The 5 in the morning alarm, the loom running until midnight, the magazine folded carefully on the shelf. Adaeze Obi, who had never once asked her daughter to carry the weight of what had been taken from her, who had simply pressed a square of fabric into a child's hand and said, "Someday you will know, 10 million euros, Adaeze 20%, her mother's retirement, her cousin's school fees, the architecture of an entire family's future, restructured in a single document. Her hands were not steady when Jin-Ho walked in. He read her face before he read the letter. She watched him do it, the quick, precise assessment, the way his eyes moved from her expression to the envelope to her hands, and assembled the full picture in the time it took most people to register that something had happened. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the work table and looked at her with an expression she had learned, over 3 months of daily proximity, to read with uncomfortable accuracy. He was not calculating his own position. He was watching hers. "My mother could retire," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Tomorrow. She could close the stall tomorrow and never set another 5 in the morning alarm in her life." She pressed her fingers flat on the envelope. "My cousins, there are 6 of them still in school. My aunt has a medication she rations because it's too expensive to take the full dose." She stopped, breathed. "I've sent money home since my first fellowship stipend. I've sent money home every month for 10 years. But this," she looked up, "this is a different category of change entirely." Jin-Ho said nothing. He simply looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the quality of his silence was not emptiness, but the active, careful presence of a man who understood that some things needed to be said aloud before they could be processed, and that his role in this moment was to receive rather than respond. That undid her, quietly, in a way the number had not. "You've had money your whole life," she said. "You don't know what it is to look at a figure and see inside it every sacrifice that bought you the room to be standing here." "You're right," he said. "I don't. So tell me what you think, honestly." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Seoul moved through its gray Monday morning, indifferent as ever to the private weight of the decisions made inside it. "I think," he said carefully, "that this decision is not the same for both of us, and I will not pretend otherwise." He held her gaze. "I think that whatever you choose, I will find a way to make it work." A pause, brief, weighted, honest. "And I think that the only answer I can give you that is entirely true is this. I want to do whatever keeps you in this room." Studio went silent. Adaeze felt the words land, not as a confession, not as a declaration, but as a simple, unguarded statement of fact from a man who had stopped managing what he revealed somewhere around the 3rd week of working beside her, and the simplicity of it moved through her with more force than any more elaborate expression could have. She looked away first. "We need to think," she said. "We have tonight. Tonight isn't enough for a decision this size," he agreed, "but it's enough for dinner." He stood, rolling his sleeves down, the small, habitual motion she had watched dozens of times and had stopped pretending not to notice. "I'll get food. Don't decide anything alone." He left, and Adaeze stood in the studio with the Paris letter and the indigo fabric and the architectural sketches, and the ghost of "I want to do whatever keeps you in this room" resonating in the empty air, and felt the ground tilting in 2 directions simultaneously. The weight of what the number could give her family, the weight of what Oja was becoming, and underneath both of them, running like a current through everything, the specific and dangerous warmth of a man who brought food from the right place and waited without impatience, and had never once, in 3 months of the most sustained proximity she had ever shared with another person, made her feel like anything other than the most important presence in whatever room they occupied together. She pressed her hands flat on the work table. She breathed. 50 million euros on one side, everything else on the other. And Jin-Ho, somewhere in the city, walking toward a pajang matcha that smelled like home, he came back with food from the pajang matcha 3 streets over. The kind of place that had no menu and no pretension, where the owner ladled whatever was ready into styrofoam containers without asking what you wanted, because what you wanted was beside the point. Jin-Ho set everything on the work table between the fabric samples and the acquisition letter, and Adaeze looked at the containers and then at him and felt something loosen in her chest that she was not prepared for. "You know that place," she said. "Been going there since I was 22. He pulled up a stool on his side of the table. "When I was a design student with no money and large ideas, the owner used to let me sketch at the corner table for hours in exchange for sweeping up at closing. She never told me to leave." He paused. "She's the first person who called me after the scandal. She said, 'Come and eat, nothing else.'" Adaeze sat down slowly. "What did you say?" I went. He opened the containers without ceremony. "She didn't mention the scandal. She put food in front of me and talked about her grandchildren and sent me home with enough for the next morning." His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply not leave. Studio was quiet. Outside, the rain had softened to something barely audible, more presence than sound. Adaeze picked up her spoon and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not either diminish what he'd shared or expose more of herself than she was ready to. She settled for the truth. A small piece of it. "My mother does that," she said. "When things are bad, she doesn't ask questions. She just cooks. The worse the crisis, the more elaborate the meal." She almost smiled. "When I published the post about your collection and the world went sideways for 3 days, she sent me a voice note, 22 minutes long. The entire thing was just her cooking, the sounds of it, oil hitting the pan, the knife on the board, water coming to a boil." She looked down at the container. "She didn't say a word. She just let me listen to home." Jin-Ho had gone very still across the table. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that struck her like a physical thing, open and unguarded and completely without agenda, the face of a man who was not managing an impression or calculating an outcome. He was simply looking at her the way people look at things they are afraid of losing before they have properly had them. "Adaeze." His voice was low. "Don't." She said it softly this time, not a warning, almost a plea. "I need to say one thing." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and the distance between them shrank in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the quality of his attention. "You can tell me to stop after, but I need to say it." She put her spoon down. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. "When you walked into my office 3 months ago," he said, "I thought I understood what this was, a professional arrangement, a form of reparation. I told myself I could keep it clean, keep it structured, keep you at the exact distance that the situation required." A pause. "I have been failing at that for approximately 10 weeks. Adaeze said nothing. "Notice everything," he said. "That is the problem, and I know it. I notice the way you read fabric before you look at it. I notice that you argue in complete sentences even when you're angry, which is more often than you admit. I notice that you have never once asked me to make this easier for you, even when it is plainly costing you something." His voice dropped. "I notice that you said not yet, and I have been holding that word like something I am not entirely sure I deserve." Rain touched the windows. Adaeze felt the precise moment her composure stopped being a choice and became simply a thing she was holding with both hands, knowing it would not hold indefinitely. "You know what they'll say," she said. "If this becomes anything. You know the story they'll write. Yes, they'll say I engineered this, that the post, the partnership, all of it was a calculated move to position myself. They'll take everything I've built and reframe it as a seduction strategy." Her voice did not waver, but her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the studio lighting. "I have fought my entire career to be seen as what I am. A scholar, a professional, a woman who knows exactly what she knows and earned the right to say it. One headline can undo 10 years. I know," he said, "and I will never ask you to risk that lightly." "Then what are you asking?" He stood. He came around the table slowly, unhurried. In the way that was entirely characteristic of him, the patience of someone who had decided and was not revering the decision. He stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he reached out and with one hand brushed a thread of indigo cotton from her sleeve, the smallest, most peripheral touch, and somehow that undid her more completely than anything else could have. "I am asking," he said quietly, "if you will let me stand beside you while they say it. Not in front, beside. And answer them with you." Adaeze stood up. She was almost exactly his height, and she looked at him directly, the way she looked at every difficult thing in her life, without flinching, without softening, without the protective distance that had kept her safe and solitary for longer than she wanted to examine. "Terrified," she said. "I know, so am I. You don't look it. I have been terrified since the second week." Something moved in his eyes, wry and warm and entirely sincere. "I am simply Korean." "We perform composure while internally dismantling." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, and it escaped before she could contain it, genuine and unguarded and briefly, beautifully uncontrolled. He watched it happen with an expression that made her breath catch all over again. "Jin-Ho. Yes, if we do this," she began. "We do it completely," he said. "No halfway, no managed distance, no pretending in rooms where people are watching and then being honest only when no one can see. Completely or not at all." She looked at him for a long moment. The acquisition letter sat on the table behind her, 50 million euros and an entire future, and it felt suddenly like the least important thing in the room. "Completely," she said. He cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness entirely at odds with the intensity of everything preceding it. And when he kissed her, it was unhurried and certain, and tasted like a decision made weeks ago finally arriving at itself. And Adaeze, who had built her life on precision and documentation, and the careful cataloging of what things were worth, felt the last of her calculations dissolve entirely. They stood in the indigo-scented studio, with Seoul reigning quietly outside, and held each other like people who had both been alone for too long, and were only now admitting what that cost. The keynote invitation came from the Seoul Design Council 3 weeks later. The annual conference drew every significant voice in Asian fashion and design, and the invitation was addressed to both of them, Seo Jin-Ho and Dr. Adaeze Obi, co-founders of Oja, which itself was a statement the industry would spend a week analyzing. Adaeze almost declined, not because she was afraid of the stage. She had spoken at conferences across 4 continents, and a lectern held no terror for her. She almost declined because she knew what it meant to stand beside Jin-Ho in front of that room. It meant the story became real in a way that the studio and the quiet evenings and the indigo-scented privacy of their developing world had allowed them to defer. "You should give the keynote alone," she told him 2 nights before. He looked up from the fabric layout he was reviewing. "Why?" "Because you going first gives the narrative time to settle. If we stand up there together right now, the coverage will be about us. Not about Oja, not about the partner collectives, us." He considered this with the focused stillness she had come to recognize as him actually thinking rather than formulating a response. "You're right," he said finally. "And," she blinked. "And what?" "You said I should go alone, but you haven't said what you're going to do." She had not told him yet. She had been sitting with the decision for 5 days, turning it over, examining it from every angle the way she examined fabric, testing for weight, for tension, for where it would hold and where it would give. "I'm going to tell the full story," she said. "From the beginning. My original research, the scandal, Sungwon's role, what you chose and why, and what we built after." She paused. "I'm going to do it from the stage, publicly, in front of everyone who spent the last year deciding what they thought about both of us." Jin-Ho set down the fabric. "Adaeze, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Her voice was steady. "I want to, not for you, for the record. Because I spent my career insisting on accurate attribution, and I'm not going to let an inaccurate story about the man She stopped, recalibrated. "About my co-founders stand uncorrected." He looked at her across the work table with those dark, unhurried eyes, and said nothing for long enough that she felt the silence as something warm and weighted. "Man you," he repeated softly. "Push it." Corner of his mouth moved. "Never." The morning of the conference arrived cold and bright, the kind of Seoul autumn morning that felt like a held breath. Adaeze dressed with deliberate care, a fitted *** jacket in the deep rust and gold of the Abyokota collective, tailored to her specific measurements by Mama Falisade's granddaughter, worn over wide-leg black trousers. She wore her hair natural, crown out, uncompromising. She looked in the mirror and saw her mother's daughter, and she squared her shoulders and left. Jin-Ho was waiting in the lobby. He saw her and went still in the way that she had stopped pretending not to notice. "You look," he started. "Professional," she said firmly. "Extraordinary," he said, at exactly the same moment. They held each other's gaze for one beat, too, and then she walked past him toward the car and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further was needed. He spoke first. 20 minutes clean, direct, no performance of humility, simply honest. He talked about what the house of Seo had been built on and what it had cost others. He talked about Oja and its founding principles without making it sound like penance. He talked about what genuine collaboration looked like as opposed to what the industry had been calling collaboration for decades. The room was attentive in the way rooms are when they are not sure what they are being handed. Then Adaeze walked to the lectern. She had no notes. She never used notes. She spoke for 34 minutes and the room did not move. She told the full story. Her mother's fabric. The European runway. 16 years of watching the industry consume what it did not understand and could not credit. She talked about the post, about what had motivated it, and what it had cost her professionally. She talked about the letter that arrived on a Tuesday in handwritten Korean. She talked about Sungwon naming him, not to punish, but because the record required it, because accuracy was not cruelty, and the truth was not a weapon unless someone was using a lie as a shield. She talked about what she and Jin-Ho had built, and exactly what it was built on, and who it would serve. And then she said, clearly and without editorial, "The most important thing I have learned in 3 years of living and working in this country is that integrity is not a single act. It is a practice. It is the decision made in 4 minutes when the cost is everything. It is the woman who stays when leaving would be easier. It is the man who reads a document 17 times until he understands not just what he did, but why it was wrong." She paused. That is what Adaeze is built on. Not charity, not redemption theater. The genuine, unglamorous, daily practice of doing what is right when it would be far more convenient not to. Silence lasted 3 full seconds after she finished. Then the room came to its feet. Jin-Ho was standing at the side of the stage, and she walked toward him, and he looked at her with an expression she felt in every layer of herself, pride and something deeper than pride, something that had no professional vocabulary, something that simply and completely was. "You didn't mention us," he said quietly as she reached him. "That's ours," she said. "Not theirs." He took her hand. Right there in the wing of the stage, in full view of the industry that had spent a year constructing narratives about both of them, he took her hand and held it, and she let him. The acquisition offer from Paris was declined that afternoon. They sent a joint letter, 2 paragraphs, professional and final. The conglomerate's representative called twice. Jin-Ho did not answer. Adaeze answered on the 3rd call, said our decision is not under review, and ended the call in under 60 seconds. The Oja launch showcase was scheduled for the following month. The partner collectives flew in 14 women from Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Abuja, including Mama Falisade's granddaughter, who arrived with a bolt of indigo cloth and presented it to Adaeze with both hands and a smile that contained generations. Jin-Ho's mother came. She came without announcement, without invitation, appearing in the front row of the showcase venue 30 minutes before doors opened. Jin-Ho saw her first. He went to her, and Adaeze watched from across the room as something passed between them. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the first negotiated breath of it, 2 people deciding that love was worth the discomfort of revision. His mother turned and looked at Adaeze across the room. Adaeze met her gaze directly and did not look away. After a long moment, Jin-Ho's mother gave a single, small nod, the kind that costs something and means precisely because of what it costs. Adaeze nodded back with equal gravity, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. The showcase was extraordinary. 14 looks, each one a documented collaboration, the garment's origin story printed in the show notes alongside the name of the designing collective, the specific community, the artisan's name in full. No anonymity, no erasure. The models moved through the space to music composed by a Lagos-born producer working with a Seoul string quartet, and the collision of sounds was not gentle, but it was true, and the room felt it. When the final look appeared, Adaeze's rust and gold Seo oak reimagined as an evening gown, restructured through Jin-Ho's architectural lens, while every thread of its Abyokota origin remained intact and named. The room understood what Adaeze was proposing. Not fusion, not appreciation. something harder and rarer and more honest than either. The press coverage broke before midnight. He found her on the rooftop. The venue was an old hanok building in Bukshan that the owner had converted to an event space, and the rooftop looked out over the tiled curves of the neighborhood toward the city's glittering sprawl. Adaeze was standing at the railing with her arms folded across her chest, not against the cold, but in the particular posture of someone processing something too large and too good to absorb all at once. She heard him behind her and didn't turn. "Everyone's asking for you downstairs," she said. "Everyone can wait." He came to stand beside her at the railing. Their arms touched, the warmth of him familiar now in a way that still surprised her every time. "How are you?" "Overwhelmed." She exhaled slowly. In the best possible way, the kind of overwhelmed that feels like arrival, like you've been traveling so long you forgot you were moving, and then suddenly you're somewhere and you recognize it. She shook her head slightly. "That probably makes no sense." "It makes complete sense." A pause. "My grandmother used to say there are places the soul recognizes before the mind catches up." Adaeze turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and something in his expression made her go still, not the warm intensity she had grown accustomed to, but something beneath it, something with a different quality of weight. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I had this made 3 weeks ago," he said. "By the Abiokota Collective. I sent them the specifications. I told them what I needed it to mean." He opened a small cloth box, wrapped in the indigo fabric, tied with a narrow strip of gold thread, and inside was a ring unlike anything she had seen. The band was Korean silver, structured in the clean geometric lines of traditional pajagi patchwork. Set into it was a single deep blue stone the exact color of Yoruba indigo resist dye, and around the setting, inlaid in delicate gold, was a pattern she recognized with a sharp intake of breath, her mother's chevron, the one from the magazine. The one Ngozi had folded and placed on the shelf above the loom and waited for her daughter to know what to do with. Adaeze pressed one hand over her mouth. "I spoke to your mother," Jin-Ho said quietly. 6 weeks ago. I called her and I introduced myself and I asked her permission and she talked to me for 45 minutes and at the end she said," his voice caught slightly, the first fracture in his composure she had ever witnessed. "She said my daughter has been fighting her whole life. Make sure she knows she is also allowed to rest." Adaeze's eyes were streaming now, and she did not care, not even slightly. "I am not asking you to stop fighting," he said. "I would never ask you that. I am asking if you will let me fight beside you. For Oja, for what it stands for the women whose names we will spend the rest of our lives making sure the world knows." He looked at her steadily, this man who had read a document 17 times until he understood what it meant to be wrong, who had chosen silence to protect a family that wasn't his, who had come to her not with excuses, but with a letter and a willingness to be changed. "And for us. Adaeze, I love you. I love the precision of you and the fire of you and the way you read cloth before you look at it. I love that you are the most formidable person I have ever been afraid of disappointing. Will you marry me?" She laughed and wept simultaneously, which she had not known was physically possible until this moment. "You called my mother," she said. "I called your mother. Talked to you for 45 minutes. She asked me 14 questions. I have the notes." Adaeze laughed again, the sound of it dissolving into the cool Bukshan air, and she took his face in both hands and kissed him with everything she had, all the weeks of not yet and not quite and I can't afford this. And then she pulled back and looked at him and said, "Yes. Obviously yes, you stubborn, wonderful man. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had always known where it was going. Below them, Seoul blazed and moved and carried on, indifferent as ever to the private revolutions happening in its rooftops and studios and Pajangmacha corners. The city had seen empires rise and fall and be rebuilt by hands that simply refused to stop working. And it would see this too. The label in the show notes with 14 names that were not decoration, but truth. The ring made of 2 histories wound into one. The woman who had come to document a theft and stayed to build a different kind of story. Adaeze leaned into Jin-Ho on that rooftop, the indigo ring warm on her finger, and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Safe, chosen, arrived, her phone lit up in her pocket. She ignored it. It lit up again. Jin-Ho felt her stillness and pulled back. "What is it?" She looked at the screen. A message from a number she did not recognize, international prefix, routed through a Lagos exchange. 4 words and a document attachment that, Even in the notification preview, showed the letterhead of the Paris conglomerate she and Jin-Ho had declined 3 weeks ago. 4 words, "We approached your mother." Below it, partially visible in the preview, the first line of the attached document, exclusive licensing agreement, Adaeze Obi Textile Collective, binding for 15 years. Adeeze's blood went cold. She looked up at Jin-Ho and watched his expression shift as he read her face. "What's wrong?" She turned the phone toward him. In the rooftop silence, with the city blazing below and the indigo ring warm on her finger, and the entire architecture of the life they were building standing around them like something real and permanent and earned, the ground moved again, not with a rival this time, with something else entirely.